Welcome back to the deep dive. Usually when we sit down to look at a document, we're sort of blowing dust off something from the archives.
Looking back at history.
Exactly. Trying to piece together what happened, 5, 10, 50 years ago. But today is different. We're looking at something that has barely cooled down.
That's right. We are analyzing a formal letter of complaint that was sent today, Sunday, February 8th, 2026.
Hot off the press. It's addressed to the Commonwealth Ombudsman, and it's from a Mr. J. Telford. Now, he's the secretary of a group called VOFF.
That's the Victims of Financial Fraud.
Right. And for anyone listening who doesn't live and breathe Australian financial scandals, VOFF represents a very specific, and I think it's fair to say, very aggrieved group of people.
Definitely. We're talking about independent investors and people with self-managed superannuation funds, we'll just call them SMSS, who lost, well, a huge amount of their retirement savings in the Trio Capital fraud.
And let's just get the top-line summary out there right away. This is not just a letter asking for money back. It's not a standard complaint.
No, not even close. This is a document that accuses the Australian government, and specifically the regulator ASIC and the former superannuation minister, Bill Shorten, of, well, fundamentally rewriting history.
That is a huge claim to make. We're not talking about a small mistake here.
No. The core argument, the whole thesis of this letter, is that a sophisticated transnational crime, the Trio fraud, was deliberately and politically rebranded as just bad financial advice.
Wow.
And the letter argues this was done to protect political allies and, the reputation of the big industry superfunds.
So basically, instead of the official story being the police failed to stop the burglars, it became you shouldn't have left your window open.
That is a perfect way to put it. And the letter claims this was no accident. It was a deliberate strategy. So today we're going to unpack the legal arguments, the alleged conflicts of interest, and what the letter calls this unavoidable fork when it comes to integrity.
Okay, let's start with the crime itself, just to set the stakes. Trio Capital. This was the largest superannuation fraud in Australian history at the time, wasn't it?
Yeah.
You're talking about what? $176 million just gone.
Correct. And it's really important to understand how it vanished. This wasn't just a bad stock tick or the market going down.
Yeah.
These funds were funneled offshore to the British Virgin Islands. It was theft, a criminal operation. But the letter argues that the moment the dust settled, the official narrative just completely shifted gears.
And this is the part of the letter titled The Reframing Crime versus Advice.
Exactly. So if you just look at the raw numbers, there were about 155 financial advisors who had clients invested in these fraudulent Trio funds.
Okay, so a pretty wide net. That suggests the fraud was, convincing enough to fool a lot of professionals.
It was. But the letter highlights a statistical anomaly that's, well, it's genuinely hard to explain away.
Which is?
ASIC and the government effectively only went after the advisors who recommended Trio to one group.
The self-managed super funds.
Just them.
Okay, wait, let's pause there. We need to really clarify this for you, the listener, because this distinction is the absolute linchpin of the whole argument.
It is.
In Australia, you basically have two choices for your retirement money. You can put it in a big APRA-regulated fund, often run by unions or banks, and they manage it all for you. Or you can start an SMSF, a self-managed super fund, where you call the shots.
It's the difference between taking the bus and driving your own car, essentially.
Right. So here's the kicker, as the letter points out. The big union-operated funds, the buses, they also invested in Trio. They also lost millions in the exact same fraud.
So the bus crashed and the car crashed. Same road, same pothole, same criminal gang that dug the hole.
But the government's reaction was completely different for each group.
Totally different. For the union funds, the story was that they were victims of a really sophisticated crime. They lost their money through, and this is a quote, no fault of their own.
And they got their money back, right? The government stepped in.
They did. Investors in those APRA funds were compensated. They were made whole.
But for the SMSF drivers, the people managing their own retirement,
for them, it was painted as their own fault. The letter quotes Bill Shorten directly. He was the Minister for Superannuation at the time, and he described these SMSF investors as swimming outside the flags.
Swimming outside the flags. As an Aussie, I know exactly what that image does. It's so visceral. It implies you were reckless, you ignored the lifeguards, you went into dangerous water, and, you deserve what you get.
It's a very, very potent metaphor. And the letter argues it was used with improper purpose. By framing the SMSF sector as this kind of Wild West, the government managed to do two things. First, it deflected all the attention away from the fact that ASIC, the lifeguard in your analogy, was basically asleep on the job.
It's a classic distraction. If you're busy blaming the victim for taking a risk, you're not asking why the regulator licensed a fraudster to begin with.
Precisely. And second, the letter argues it served a very clear economic purpose. It scares people away from managing their own money and pushes them back into the big institutional funds. It protects the system.
At the expense of the individual.
Yeah.
And this brings us to the part of the letter that, well, it starts naming names. It moves from this general idea of bias to a very specific allegation of a conflict of interest. We have to talk about the Ross Tarrant case.
Yes, this is where the letter gets incredibly specific. Ross Tarrant was a financial advisor based in Wollongong, and like many others, he'd recommended Trio products to his clients.
And the letter claims that Minister Shorten's office specifically directed ASIC to go after him, to target him.
That is the allegation.
Yeah.
That they wanted to make an example out of him. The narrative was built. Tarrant gave bad advice to these poor, unsuspecting SMSF investors. ASIC investigated, and, well, Tarrant was banned. If you just read the headlines, it looks like justice was served.
But there's a massive twist that the letter brings to light.
A huge one. What the public was never told, and what this letter really hammers home, is that Ross Tarrant was also the financial advisor to a specific branch of the Australian Workers' Union, the AWU.
The very same union that Bill Shorten used to run before he went into Parliament.
The very same. The letter claims Tarrant recommended the exact same Trio products to an AWU slush fund.
Hold on, let me get this straight. Tarrant gives advice to regular mom and dad investors. He also gives the same advice to the union. The government then destroys his career for the advice he gave to mom and dad, but stays completely silent about the advice to the union.
Because if they admitted he'd advised the union, they also have to admit the union lost money from the same bad advice. It shatters the whole narrative that the big funds were innocent victims. It would prove that even the so-called sophisticated union investors got fooled.
And the letter alleges Shorten had to have known this.
It goes even further. It alleges the AWU fund in question was registered in the name of a close personal friend of Mr. Shorten's from his union days. The argument is that Shorten had a direct conflict of interest. He was the minister in charge of the whole investigation, but he had deep personal and political ties to one of the victims, the union that he was allegedly trying to protect.
That's the war chest theory that the letter talks about, isn't it?
Exactly. The letter alleges that the money in this AWU fund wasn't just standard pension money. It was intended as a political war chest to help fund Shorten's ambition to become prime minister.
If that's true, the stakes are just incredibly high. It would mean the entire regulatory crackdown wasn't about justice for victims. It was about political damage control.
And protecting a revenue stream.
Yeah.
Just to follow the money here. The letter is very clear. The SMSF sector is a direct competitor to the big union funds. Every single dollar in an SMSF is a dollar not paying fees to a union-backed fund.
And since those funds are often major donors to the Labor Party.
You see the loop. The letter is arguing there's a direct financial incentive for a Labor government to discredit self-managed super, to sort of funnel cash back into the union system.
This is starting to feel like a political thriller, honestly. But the author, Mr. Telford, he seems to anticipate that skepticism. He provides a pattern of behavior. He brings up clean event. Now, I had to look this up to remember the details, but it is a pretty damning parallel.
It really is. For listeners who might not remember, Clean Event was a cleaning company, and this all came up during the Royal Commission into Trade Union Governance and Corruption years ago.
This was the deal where they traded away penalty rates for workers, wasn't it?
Essentially, yes. The allegation, and this is the parallel the letter draws so forcefully, is that Shorten, when he was a union leader, made a secret deal with this company, Clean Event. The company saved millions by not paying proper penalty rates to its low-paid, often migrant workers. In exchange, the company paid money to the union.
So you sacrifice the little guy to benefit the larger institution.
That is the structural argument VOFF is making. The letter basically says, look at Clean Event. He sacrificed the workers to get money for the union. Now look at Trio. He sacrificed the SMSF investors to protect the union funds. It's the same playbook.
That reframes what could look like a one-off mistake into a systemic method of operating.
Exactly. And that pivot is so important because it takes us out of the realm of just politics and media spin and squarely into the realm of law.
Right. I want to shift gears here because up until this point, we've been talking about optics and narratives. But about halfway through, this letter stops sounding like an op-ed and starts sounding like a legal brief.
And this is the strongest part of the whole document, in my view. It gets into administrative law.
Which I know sounds dry, but you need to stick with us here because Administrative law is basically the rule book that stops governments from just doing whatever they want.
It is the rule book for power. And the letter outlines 3 specific ways that ASIC and the minister allegedly broke the law. The first one is improper purpose.
Okay, define that for us.
In administrative law, a public official is given power for a specific reason, usually to enforce a law or protect citizens. If you use that power for a different reason, like saving your political skin or helping your mates or burying a scandal, that's an improper purpose. It's illegal.
So using the financial police force ASIC to create a political narrative is a misuse of their statutory power.
Correct. The second legal point is misuse of office. This is all about truth and authority. The letter argues that officials use their public platform to spread a narrative that they knew or should have known was false. They said these investors were reckless when all the evidence showed these investors were victims of a massive fraud.
It's basically federally funded gaslighting.
In a way, yes. And the third is unfair administration. ASIC has a legal duty to act fairly. You can't just punish Group A for doing the exact same thing as Group B simply because you like Group B better. By hammering the SMSFs but ignoring the union funds for making the very same investments, they failed that fairness test.
There's a concept the letter uses here that I found really powerful. It's called information asymmetry. It sounds technical, but when you break it down, it's actually just infuriating.
It's the we knew and you didn't argument. The letter really emphasizes that ASIC had investigative powers. They had offshore intelligence. They knew Trio was a house of cards long before the public did.
Right.
The mom and dad investors, they could not have possibly known that.
It's like a mechanic knowing a car has no brakes, letting you drive it off the lot, and then blaming you for hitting a tree.
That's a perfect analogy. The government held all the exclusive knowledge of the danger, failed to act on it, and then blamed the citizens for falling into the trap they failed to close. The letter actually compares this directly to the robo-debt scandal.
That is a very heavy comparison. I mean, robo-debt is still so fresh in everyone's minds as a colossal government failure.
And the parallel is strong. In robo-debt, the government knew it was acting unlawfully, but they kept going because it suited their tough-on-welfare narrative. Here, the letter argues they knew the bad advice narrative was false, but they kept using it because it suited the SMSF's are dangerous narrative.
It frames this whole affair not as a mistake, but as a fundamental crisis of integrity.
Which brings us to the question I know you're about to ask me.
I am. I have to play devil's advocate here. This fraud happened back in 2009. We're in 2026. Why are we talking about this now? Why did VOFF send this letter today? Isn't this all just ancient history?
The letter addresses that head-on. It argues this isn't ancient history at all, because the consequences are still happening right now. It specifically mentions recent collapses like First Guardian and Shield.
And these are newer investment funds that have gone bust, right?
Yes, and the argument is this. Because the government never admitted the Trio collapse was a regulatory failure, because they so successfully blamed it on bad advice, they never fixed the underlying regulations, they never fixed the engine, so the car just keeps crashing.
So the investors who are losing their money in 2026 are, in a way, direct victims of the lie that was told back in 2010.
That is the causal link the letter is drawing. If you don't diagnose the disease correctly, you can never cure it. And this leads to the conclusion of the document, which uses this brilliant rhetorical device called the unavoidable fork.
I loved this part. It sounds like something out of a philosophy class. Walk us through this fork.
It says that when you look at this alleged cover-up, the senior officials involved, shortened, the ASIC commissioners, are left with only 3 possible positions. Position 1, they did not know the official narrative was false.
Which would imply gross incompetence. I mean, if you're the head of the financial system and you don't know what's happening in your own major investigation, you really shouldn't have the job.
Exactly. Okay, position 2, they knew, but they lacked the power to fix it.
Which is just laughable for a federal minister and the head of ASIC. They have all the power.
It strains credulity, yes. So you're left with position 3. They knew and they chose silence.
They were complicit.
And the letter states very clearly, there is no 4th option where silence is benign. It forces the ombudsman to look at the situation and ask, well, which one was it? Because none of them are acceptable outcomes.
It completely strips away any plausible deniability. It says you are either incompetent, weak, or corrupt. Pick one.
And the letter describes this state of affairs as institutional complicity by omission. By leaving this false record uncorrected for over a decade and a half, the current government effectively becomes an accessory. It's an ongoing failure, not a past one.
It is a sobering read. When you peel back all the layers of acronyms and legal jargon, it's really a story about trust. You trust the referee to watch the game fairly. You assume that when a regulator speaks, they're being a neutral umpire.
Hmm.
But this source material suggests the umpire might have had a bet on the outcome.
Or at the very least was trying to make sure the game didn't get canceled so they could keep selling tickets.
Oof, that's a good way to put it. So what does this all mean for you listening at home? Why should you care about a letter sent today about a fraud from so long ago?
Because it speaks directly to the safety of the financial system right now. The letter makes a powerful point that silence stops being neutral. When a government knows its silence is actively harming consumers, that silence itself becomes a form of maladministration.
It's all about the future. If you can't trust the official post-mortem of a financial disaster, how can you possibly trust the current regulations designed to prevent the next one?
Exactly. And I think that brings us to a final, provocative thought. The letter asks us to think about the victims of First Guardian or Shield, but I would ask you, the listener, to think about this. If that narrative of bad advice really was manufactured to hide regulatory failure all those years ago, and if those same regulatory structures are still in place today, what does that mean for your own superannuation right now?
That is a chilling thought. Are we all just swimming outside the flags without even knowing it?
We just might be. And if we get into trouble, the precedent suggests the lifeguard might just blame us for getting wet.
A massive thank you to our listeners for joining us on this deep dive into the VOFF letter. It's a complex web of finance, politics, and law, but at its heart, it's a story about the official record and who gets to write it.
And the importance of questioning that record. Always.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We will see you on the next deep dive. Stay curious.